She raised her glass and smiled like it was a joke, like I was the punchline everyone had been waiting for all night. And then she said it loud enough for the entire room to hear. "My sister still doesn't have a real career, but we try not to judge." And the laughter that followed wasn't subtle. It wasn't polite. It was the kind that lingers just long enough to make sure you feel exactly where you stand. I could feel every pair of eyes shift toward me, measuring, dismissing, deciding, while my husband's family, my in-laws, sat there nodding like they'd just been handed confirmation of something they already believed about me. My mother-in-law didn't even try to hide her expression, that thin smile that always came with quiet disappointment. And my brother-in-law leaned back in his chair, swirling his drink like this was entertainment, like I had been invited here just to be reduced in front of them. And the worst part wasn't the words. It was how comfortable they all were saying them, like I had already been defined, already been placed somewhere beneath them. I remember the exact weight of the glass in my hand, the condensation slipping against my fingers, the low hum of conversation around me sharpening into something almost surgical, precise, deliberate, cutting without ever raising its voice. And I realized in that moment that this wasn't just a joke. This was a decision they had all agreed on without ever asking me. If this story speaks to your heart, if you've ever sat in a room where people decided who you were before you even opened your mouth, take a second to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from, along with your local time, only if this story truly resonates with you. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 43 years old, and that night, sitting at a long, polished dining table in a $2.5 million home just outside Chicago, was the moment everything in my family changed, even though no one else at that table realized it yet. Because while my sister was still smiling, still enjoying the attention she'd just pulled toward herself, I already knew something she didn't. Something none of them did. And in just a few minutes, the balance in that room was going to shift so completely that the same people who were laughing would forget how to speak. But to understand why that moment mattered, you have to go back to where it started. Back to a house that always had just enough space for everyone except me. Back to the quiet ways I learned early on, that being overlooked wasn't an accident. It was a role I had been given long before I ever had the chance to choose anything for myself. I did not defend myself, and that was the part that confused them the most, because people expect you to react when you are cornered. But I had learned a long time ago that silence, when used correctly, is not weakness, it is control. So I let the laughter settle. I let the moment breathe. And I lifted my glass just enough to take a slow sip, as if nothing important had been said, as if I had not just been reduced to a joke in a room full of people who were supposed to be family. Lauren kept going, of course, because people like her always do when they think they have the room on their side. She leaned slightly forward, resting her hand on the edge of the table, her voice softer now but sharper, more deliberate. "I mean, she travels a lot, but it is not like she has anything stable, right? No real title, no real company, just whatever it is she does." And a few people chuckled again, quieter this time, like they were testing how far they could push it. My husband shifted in his seat beside me, not enough to stop it, just enough to show he noticed, which somehow felt worse, because acknowledgement without action always does. And across from me, my father-in-law gave a small nod, like he was filing the information away. Like this confirmed a quiet suspicion he had never voiced out loud. I could feel the weight of their assumptions stacking, piece by piece, building a version of me that was smaller, simpler, easier to dismiss, and I let them build it, because correcting them now would have ruined the timing. The dining room itself was almost too perfect. A long dark wood table that could seat 12, soft recessed lighting, casting a warm glow across polished surfaces, floor-to-ceiling windows, framing a manicured backyard that probably cost more than the first house I ever lived in. Everything about it designed to signal success, stability, status, and yet in that moment it felt like a stage, and I knew exactly where everyone thought I stood on it. Lauren was the center. Of course she was. She always had been. Even as kids she knew how to draw attention without asking for it. The kind of person who could walk into a room and make people rearrange themselves around her without ever realizing they had done it. And now she had the career to match, a senior executive role, a title that sounded impressive even if you did not fully understand what it meant, a salary that got mentioned just enough to stay in everyone's mind. She wore it like armor, and tonight she was using it, Someone to her right asked about a project she was leading, and she lit up immediately, her tone shifting from casual to confident, describing meetings, timelines, strategy, dropping just enough industry language to remind everyone she belonged in rooms that mattered. And I watched as the same people who had laughed moments ago leaned in, interested, engaged, validating her again without question. I glanced briefly at the far end of the table, where an empty chair sat, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but I had already clocked it when I walked in, place setting untouched, glass perfectly aligned, waiting, and I checked the time without moving my wrist too, obviously. Just a slight shift of my gaze, calculating, aligning everything in my head. They thought this night was about her, about celebrating her success, about reinforcing the version of the family where she stood at the top, and I existed somewhere on the edges. But what they did not understand was that the entire structure they were so comfortable in was about to be tested by someone they respected far more than they respected me, and that was the only kind of validation that ever truly changed anything in a room like this. Lauren laughed again at something someone said, and then glanced back at me, just for a second, a quick flicker of satisfaction in her eyes like she had already won something, and I met her gaze calmly. Not challenging, not defensive, just present, because I knew something she did not, something none of them did, and as the quiet hum of conversation continued around us, I realized we were less than a few minutes away from the moment that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about me. The shift did not happen all at once. It never does. It started with something small, almost forgettable, the faint sound of the front door opening somewhere down the hallway, followed by the subtle change in the air that only certain people can create when they enter a room. Not louder, not dramatic, just different. Like the temperature had dropped a degree and everyone felt it before they understood why. One of the assistants moved first, excusing himself mid-conversation, his chair scraping softly against the hardwood floor, and then another person near the end of the table straightened their posture, adjusting their jacket as if preparing to be seen, and I watched it unfold quietly, piece by piece, like a pattern I had seen many times before. Lauren was still talking, still holding the room with a story about a recent deal, her hands moving slightly as she spoke, confident, practiced, unaware that the center of gravity was already beginning to shift away from her, and I almost felt a flicker of something that could have been sympathy if she had not been the one who started this. My mother-in-law glanced toward the doorway, just for a second, then quickly back to Lauren, trying to maintain the flow of attention where it had been, but it was already too late. Conversations were thinning, breaking apart, people losing their place mid-sentence, and their focus drifting towards something just outside the room. I did not turn my head immediately. I did not need to. I already knew who had arrived. I had known the exact minute he would step through that door, and I let the moment stretch just a little longer, letting their confusion settle in before anything became clear. Across the table, my father-in-law pushed his chair back slightly, not fully standing yet, but preparing, his expression tightening into something more formal, more respectful, and that was the first real crack in the version of the evening they thought they were controlling. Lauren paused then, just briefly, her sentence trailing off as she noticed the shift in attention, her eyes flicking toward the hallway, a hint of irritation crossing her face as if someone had interrupted her spotlight at the wrong moment, and she gave a small laugh trying to recover it, trying to pull everyone back in, but no one fully returned. Footsteps approached, steady, measured, unhurried, the kind that do not rush because they never need to. And when the figure finally appeared in the doorway, the reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Chairs moved, people stood, voices dropped, the entire room reorganizing itself around a presence that carried more weight than any title spoken at that table that night. Lauren turned fully now, her posture shifting instantly, shoulders straightening, expression brightening into something eager, expectant, ready to receive recognition. Because in her world, this was the moment that reinforced everything she had just claimed about herself. This was where her status would be confirmed in front of everyone. I finally lifted my gaze then, calm, steady, meeting the moment, without urgency, without anticipation, just certainty, because unlike everyone else in that room, I was not wondering what would happen next. I already knew, and as he stepped forward into the light, scanning the table, I could see the exact second he registered the room, the people, the arrangement, and then the exact second his attention moved past her, past the center they had built, and began to land somewhere else entirely. And in that fraction of a moment before anything was said, before anyone spoke, I realized the room had already changed, and they just had not caught up to it yet. He did not hesitate, and that was the part no one in that room was prepared for, because hesitation would have given them time to adjust, to correct, to reframe what they thought was happening. But there was none of that, not even a glance in Lauren's direction as she stepped forward slightly, already smiling, already preparing to greet him like she had done a dozen times before in controlled settings where everything followed a predictable script. Instead, he moved past her with quiet certainty, not dismissive in a rude way, just precise, intentional, as if she had never been the focal point to begin with. And I could feel the exact second her confidence faltered, not outwardly at first, but in the subtle tightening of her posture. The fraction of a second where her hand hovered mid-gesture with nowhere to land. The room followed his movement instinctively, conversations cutting off mid-word, attention shifting like a current pulling everything in one direction. And that direction was not where they expected it to be. I set my glass down slowly, the soft contact against the table almost louder now in the sudden quiet, and I stood without rushing, without making it a performance, just enough to meet him halfway as he approached, my movements controlled, measured, the same way I had been taught in rooms where presence mattered more than volume. "Evelyn," he said clearly, his voice carrying just enough to reach every corner of the dining room without needing to rise. "I was hoping you would be here." And there was a shift in the air that followed those words, not dramatic, not explosive, just final. Like something invisible had been confirmed in a way that could not be undone. He extended his hand, and I took it, firm, professional, familiar, and he gave a slight nod that carried more weight than any introduction could have. "We have been waiting on your input before moving forward," he added, and I could feel the room trying to process that sentence, trying to rearrange everything they thought they understood about me into something that made sense with what they were now seeing. Behind him, someone murmured quietly. Another person shifted their stance. And across the table, my father-in-law straightened fully now, his expression no longer neutral but alert, recalculating, while my mother-in-law's smile had disappeared entirely, replaced with something uncertain, almost cautious. Lauren had not moved, not yet. She was still standing where he had passed her, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief, as if she was waiting for the moment to correct itself, for him to turn back, to acknowledge her properly, to restore the version of reality she was more comfortable with. But that moment did not come. Instead, he turned slightly, gesturing toward me with an ease that suggested familiarity rather than formality. "I believe everyone here works with your sister," he said, not asking, not clarifying, just stating. And for the first time that night, every eye in the room landed on me without assumption, without dismissal, just attention, raw and unfiltered. I did not rush to explain, I did not fill the silence for them, because that was never how this worked. The power in moments like this was not in speaking more, it was in allowing the truth to arrive fully on its own terms. And as I met Lauren's gaze across the table, I could see it happening, the slow collapse of the certainty she had built. The realization that the story she had been telling about me all night no longer held in the presence of something she could not control, and I simply gave a small nod, not triumphant, not performative, just acknowledgement, because I had never needed them to believe me. I had only needed the right person to say my name in the right room at the right time. No one spoke, and that silence was not empty. It was heavy, layered, filled with the sound of people rethinking everything they had just said, every assumption they had made, every laugh that now hung in the air with nowhere to land. And I could see it in the way their expressions shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a room slowly coming into focus after being out of alignment. My father-in-law cleared his throat first, a small controlled gesture, as if he could reset the moment with composure alone, but his eyes were no longer dismissive. They were searching, trying to place me somewhere new within a hierarchy he understood. While my mother-in-law's hands folded neatly in front of her, her posture suddenly more attentive, more careful, as if she was aware now that she might have misjudged something important. Across the table, Lauren finally moved, a step forward, her voice lighter than before but edged with something strained. "Oh, you two know each other?" she asked. And the question itself revealed more than she intended, because it carried the assumption that she was still the bridge between worlds, still the center through which introductions should pass. He glanced at her briefly then, polite but distant, the kind of acknowledgement given when someone is present but not relevant to the moment. "Evelyn has been leading the strategic review we discussed last quarter," he said evenly, not emphasizing it, not dramatizing it, just stating it as fact. And that sentence landed differently than anything else that had been said that night, because it did not invite interpretation, it replaced it. I watched as the meaning settled across their faces in real time, the quiet recalculation, the internal shift from dismissal to recognition, and I remained exactly where I was, not stepping forward to claim anything, not explaining further, because the more I stayed still, the clearer it became that I had never needed to compete for attention in this room. I had simply been waiting for the right context. Lauren blinked once, then again, the confidence she had been holding on to slipping just enough to expose uncertainty. "Wait, you mean you are part of that project?" she said, her voice no longer carrying the same certainty, and I met her gaze calmly. "I oversee it," I replied, nothing more, no elaboration, and that was enough, more than enough. Someone to her right let out a quiet breath, another shifted their stance, and I could feel the room reorganizing itself again. This time around, a different understanding, one that placed me somewhere they had not considered before, somewhere they could not easily dismiss. My husband looked at me then in a way he had, not all evening, not with embarrassment, not with quiet avoidance, but with something closer to realization, like he was seeing a version of me that had always been there, but had never been fully acknowledged in this setting, and I held that look for a moment before letting it pass, because this was not about him, not really. The man beside me continued speaking, asking a brief question about timelines, referencing a meeting that had not yet been announced publicly, and I answered without hesitation. Concise, direct, the way I always did in rooms where clarity mattered more than performance, and with each exchange, the gap between who they thought I was and who I actually was became impossible to ignore. Lauren stepped back slowly, her earlier position at the center of the table now uncertain, displaced without anyone needing to say it out loud, and I realized then that the most powerful part of the moment was not that I had been recognized, it was that I had not changed at all. Not my tone, not my posture, not my presence. The only thing that had shifted was their understanding, and that shift was enough to turn everything they thought they knew about me into something they could no longer defend. The room did not return to what it had been, and that was the part no one said out loud, but everyone felt. Because once a truth reveals itself in a space like that, it does not politely disappear. It lingers. It reshapes the way people look at you, the way they speak to you, the way they remember what they thought they knew. The rest of the evening moved forward in a quieter, more careful rhythm, conversations softer, more measured, as if everyone had collectively agreed to step around what had just happened without fully acknowledging it. And I let them, because I did not need an apology to understand what had changed. In the weeks that followed, things shifted in subtle ways that mattered more than anything said at that table. My phone calls were returned faster, invitations were phrased differently, there was a new tone in the way my name was spoken, not louder, not exaggerated, just accurate, and while it did not erase the years of being overlooked, it created something I had not had before in that family. Space, real space, the kind that does not ask you to shrink in order to be accepted. Lauren and I spoke again, not immediately, not dramatically, but eventually, and it was different. Not warmer, not closer, but clearer. The unspoken competition that had defined so much of our dynamic no longer had the same foundation, because it turns out when someone can no longer place you beneath them, they either have to meet you where you are or step back entirely, and she was still deciding which one she was willing to do. I did not push her. I did not explain myself. I did not revisit that night in detail, because some lessons do not need to be repeated to be understood, and some boundaries are stronger when they are quiet. What I learned from that night was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about understanding how easily people define you when you let them speak unchecked, and how powerful it is to stop interrupting your own timing just to make others comfortable, because not every moment is meant to be corrected in real time. Some are meant to unfold exactly as they are, so the truth can arrive without resistance. If you are listening to this, and you have ever felt underestimated, dismissed, or quietly pushed into a version of yourself that never felt quite right, I want you to know that your value does not decrease just because someone else cannot see it yet, and you do not have to rush to prove it to them. Protect your work, protect your energy, protect your financial independence, and most importantly, protect your sense of self. Because once that is stable, everything else aligns in time. Trust your instincts when something feels off. That quiet voice is not weakness, it is awareness. And whether you call it intuition, faith, or something deeper, I believe there is a reason you feel it when you do. Because sometimes God, or the universe, or whatever you believe in, is simply giving you a moment to pause, to observe, and to choose your response with intention instead of reaction. Healing does not come from forcing people to understand you. It comes from no longer needing them to in order to move forward. And there is a kind of freedom in that, a calm, steady kind of freedom that does not rely on anyone else's approval to exist. So wherever you are right now, whatever room you feel unseen in, know that you are not alone in that feeling, and it does not define your ending. It is just a moment in a much longer story that you still control. Thank you for staying with me through this, for listening, for recognizing pieces of your own story in mine, because sometimes just knowing someone else has felt it too makes the weight a little lighter. If this story stayed with you, feel free to share where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. And if you want more stories like this, you can subscribe, only if it feels right to you. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 43 years old, and the lesson I want to leave you with is simple. Never let someone else's limited view of you become the limit you place on yourself.